The following is a presentation of the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, advancing the world of work.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thanks for coming and listening to the third CAHRS webcast of 2017. I'm happy to be joined today by our three CAHRS Research Assistants, Mara, Janelle, and Nick, and they're here to talk to us about the research they've been working on HR and the role of HR in driving organizational innovation. Just as a quick reminder, as with all of our webcasts, we'll be taking questions throughout the session, so please feel free to type in your questions and we'll try to get to as many as we can throughout the day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick to kick us off and tell us a little bit about their study, and then we'll move on to the next.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you everyone for being with us today for this webcast. We know your time is really valuable. We hope to really make the most of it. As Chris said, we're going to be talking to you about the intersection between HR and innovation. This is a topic we've been looking at the entire school year, so we're super excited to share our findings and insights with you today. So just to walk you through our agenda, first we'll share an introduction with you as to why we wanted to look at this topic of HR and innovation, as well as our methodology for the research. Next, we'll look at the barriers to innovation, as well as the drivers of innovation success. Finally, we'll walk you through some recommendations for HR leaders, how each of you could drive and shape this kind of work within your firms. So first off, why do we want to look at innovation? When we think about today's market, many of you have heard this term, the 3 C's. And the 3 C's stands for change, complexity, and competition. And they're really driven by these very turbulent, constant market forces that all companies these days have to deal with. And as a result of these forces, very large, very successful companies have failed very publicly in a lot of cases. Netflix and Blockbuster is one example we have up there on the screen. There's Amazon and Borders, there's Uber and taxi drivers, the list goes on and on. And yet, despite these very stark, very public reminders, a lot of firms remain overconfident or unprepared to deal with the realities of changing markets and disruptive innovation. Yet, recent research suggests that these changes are not going away, and in fact, they're getting worse and more turbulent. And one research report shows that by 2016 or 2026, within 10 years, the S&P 500 is actually scheduled to turn over or forecasted to turn over by a rate of 50%. And that, of course, is driven by M&A and startup activity and really innovation at the core of a lot of that. And as a result, we think that innovation and developing deep capabilities within this category has never been more important for large companies, both for long-term growth but also near-term survival. So the good news here is that when we talk to you, each of you, about this topic, we got some great insights. And one of those is that HR is uniquely situated to drive value within the work of innovation. And when we think about what innovation truly requires, that it's not just R&D, it's not just technical people, but it's a long value chain of functions and activities that have to take place. We realize that the one group, the one corporate function that is uniquely embedded within each of these steps in the process is HR. And as a result, we think that there's a lot of ways that HR can get involved and add value. And so that's what we hope to talk with you about today. Now I'll turn it over to Mara to kind of get into our first section.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. So we started this process with a literature review about innovation. And what we found that there's lots of information about innovation and how organizations can be successful at innovation. But what we didn't find out there was how HR can really influence or affect this process. We think that HR has a lot to offer in this category, especially when you think of success and innovation. There's things like diversity, talent, strategy. And these are all areas that HR can deeply affect. And even though the process to innovation may seem very simple, it's actually quite complicated. So we definitely think that HR can do something to facilitate this ease of innovation throughout the organization. We started with 41 interviews from 31 different unique CAHRS partner companies. We talked to 11 line leaders to get a depth of richness in our data. So these are people who are doing R&D on the forefront, supply chain, marketing, anything that you can think of. And we had 3 key questions that we wanted answered. Those were, what are the barriers to innovation? What are the key drivers of innovation success? And last, how can HR support innovation within organizations? We'll start with barriers to innovation success. There are 5 barriers to innovation success, or these are the top 5 barriers to innovation success. You can read about all of them in our white paper. They're failure to communicate, missing the market, a poor culture of innovation, not failing fast enough, and not having the right talent. Today we're going to be talking about 3 of these, which is failure to communicate and missing the market. Although there's another one that is not mentioned on here, we'll be talking also about escalation of commitment because we think it's very important to our CAHRS partners and that they'll get a lot of information out of it. With that, I'd like to move on to our first one, which is lack of communication. Lack of communication can both be internal or external. When we talk about lack of internal communication, that could be across functions or up and down. When we talk of lack about external communication, that can be with direct customers, the business, government or regulatory agencies, supply chain, or anyone who's external to the organization. Essentially, what lack of communication is the inability to have information travel throughout the organization. So it could be siloed or trapped within one function, a team, or a person, but it's not getting to where it needs to be throughout the organization. And this can happen internally early in the innovation process when an innovation is just starting out or towards the end. It can happen externally, usually typically when you're talking to your consumers directly and really trying to develop that innovation. So an example of lack of internal communication and silos, we talked to a large services firm who had developed a unique solution for their consumers. They went all the way through the innovation process with this particular solution, starting with research and development, or were about ready to release to the market when they found out that their sales and marketing team didn't have the internal capabilities to release the solution as intended. And so therefore the innovation project stalled and wasn't able to be completed. Now, had this team talked to sales and marketing early on in the process involving them, it's quite possible that this lack of internal communication wouldn't have been an issue and that the product could have gotten to the customers as intended. Another example of lack of internal communication would be a failure to capture lessons learned or have a post-mortem process. We asked a lot of CAHRS partners what they did when an innovation was a success or a failure, and the answer was not much. That data of what occurred and why and how isn't getting throughout the organization where it could be utilized, which is really critical when you think about it. It's important to keep from repeating your past mistakes. And as Janelle is going to talk about later on, this can actually be a very effective HR success or innovation story. Essentially, when it comes to lack of internal communication, it's about making sure that there's an alignment of information throughout the organization. When you think about external lack of communication, this typically means that the organization is focusing internally and not effectively partnering. With that, I'd like to move on to the next section, which is missing the market. Missing the market is the inability to connect innovation to commercial viability. When we asked our CAHRS partners what this meant, they typically said something along the lines of, the market wasn't ready, the product was too ahead of the time, the customer didn't want the innovation. One example of missing the market is a development process that takes too long. So an example of this is one pharmaceutical firm we talked to. The firm had developed a unique medication that they thought was going to really resonate with customers. Unfortunately, in this industry, not only is it important to deliver innovation, but it's important to deliver innovation quickly and be first to market to gain that competitive advantage. What happened was a competitor came in with a similar medication and was able to beat them to the market. This caused this company's innovation to actually flounder, and they decided not to release it in the end because they didn't think there was going to be commercial viability. Another example of missing the market is a product not being what the customer wanted. So one example of this was a consumer packaged goods company we talked to who had a competitor's product that they saw was becoming very popular. Not wanting to be left behind and get on the bandwagon, they quickly developed and released their own product without really thinking about how it was going to resonate with their brand or how consumers are going to react to it. In the end, the sales fell flat because the organization didn't take time to think about the market and what they wanted holistically. Missing the market can also mean having a product being dead on arrival due to internal misalignment. And we kind of talked about that already with that communication piece of that services industry that had that innovation that wasn't even being able to be released to the market. Basically, a project must have a logical purpose and sound investment principles in order to make sure it hits the market. With that, I'd like to move on to the next section, which is escalation of commitment. Escalation of commitment is an idea being pushed up through the ranks of an organization by an influential leader or key talent, and those around the leader or key talent aren't necessarily on board with the idea. They have some reservations, but they allow the idea to be pushed up anyway, simply because they either like the leader too much or they fear the leader too much to step in and say anything. It's really important to stop escalation of commitment because resources are limited. We all have that friend, who has a really exciting idea, and it's a bad idea, but you just can't step in and say anything because you don't want to be the bad guy. But what we find out is that somebody in the organization does have to be the voice of reason on occasion. Being married to a type of idea or technology isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you have to make sure it's for the right reasons. An example of escalation of commitment is a stubborn leader. So one manufacturing organization we talked to had a leader who was very in love with a certain type of technology. This leader invested months of resources and time into this particular project, when in reality it had little to no commercial viability. If someone had been willing to step in and stop this escalation of commitment, it's quite possible that the organization could have saved themselves some resources and a bit of a headache. Of course, escalation of commitment isn't just about leaders championing an idea. It could be talent or key talent. So organizations are doing whatever it takes to get the hot new talent and to keep them. One manufacturing organization we talked to hired a group of engineers, and one way to attract them was that they allowed them to work on their own innovation projects, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there are so many innovation projects and nobody keeping track or willing to step in and stop the escalation of commitment that several of the innovation projects ran away. Again, not having any commercial viability, simply being these engineers' pet projects. It's really important to make sure that escalation of commitment doesn't go too far. With that, I'd like to open it up for question and answer.
Great. Thanks, Mara. So again, I'll just keep encouraging you all to send us in questions as they come up. We've got a few so far. So the first one, there's a couple people who have gone back to the first part of this around the communication piece, and really wonder if you've got examples of where external communication didn't work, or some examples to highlight what that means.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Chris. So we did have a few examples of not communicating externally. So one example of this was a pharmaceutical organization who wanted to streamline their innovation process because it's very important, like we talked about, to get to market quickly. And so they developed a process that was going to make the regulation a bit quicker. But what happened was they were very, very internally focused and developed a solution without partnering externally with the right regulatory or governmental bodies. And so once they had developed the solution and got it to those particular bodies, they rejected it. And so instead of working with those entities from the very beginning and partnering with them, they were very internally focused. And so this caused their innovation to flounder and not be as successful as it could have been had they been willing to network and talk to others.
Great. That's super helpful. Second set of questions. People are going back to the original chart you show, the bar graph with different aspects of what creates failure. And one of the ones that keep coming up is the notion of culture as a barrier. So if one of the three of you maybe can talk a little bit about what the culture barrier to innovation is.
Yeah, I can take that on.
Good.
Okay, so as far as a poor culture goes, I think the main driver is having a support system that really encourages risk-taking, and leadership should be pushing and supporting that. So if they're not backing up their actions with words, that's really going to hinder further exploration in the process. So, for example, one company we talked to said, oh, we are so great at encouraging risk-taking and we want our employees to fail fast. And then as the conversation went on, they started mentioning people that started getting fired for not failing, or too big of failures, or not having results in enough time and whatnot. So just making sure that your leadership is encouraging that, but also backing it up with actions. I'd also encourage, from the different conversations we had, it seemed as if the boundaries that you set your innovation players up with really are key. So if they're too small and there's not enough leeway, there's really strict guidelines on where they have to be, they're going to not be able to innovate and provide great solutions. In the same way, if there's too large of boundaries, then they could stray away from the ultimate strategy and not really have a common approach of what the consumer problem is.
Good. That's great. So I know there's a couple more questions, but I want to keep us moving along on the content. I'll also encourage you all to, if you have more questions, we'll take some more at the end, but also to refer back to the white paper that the students produced, which is already put up on the CAHRS website. So that maybe we'll move on to our next section with Nick.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So kind of just to take us back to the overview, we talked about barriers to innovation. Now we'll jump into the key drivers of innovation success. So when we ask CAHRS partners about what leads to innovation success, tell us some stories and the drivers behind them. We heard dozens of stories and insights, and what really rose to the top are the 5 that you see here on the screen. In particular, we're going to go into 3 of them with you, and they are leadership, focus on the customer, and disruptive innovation groups. We chose these 3 because, based on the insights and the stories we got, they had more richness, more nuance and detail, and so we thought there would be more value in going through these with you. So leadership is up first. In this category, one of the most important things that CAHRS partners told us is that leaders must be great communicators. And what that means is they need to set and create a clear innovation vision. And a lot of times what that means is making it very clear that innovation is everyone's job. This is something that most firms really want to see nowadays. They don't want just the technical group. They want everyone innovating within their sphere. And they also want innovation to be a collaborative, coordinated effort where all these functions and teams are working very, very positively and effectively together. And if companies want that to be the case, it really stands to reason that communication and clarity of strategy and vision is really important. We think this is especially important for companies that are putting innovation as the centerpiece of a larger change management effort. We know that with change management, you can never communicate enough, and so the repetition and the frequency really matters here. Second thing is that to truly support innovation, leaders must strive to be a role model and lead by example. And there's a lot of organizational research on this topic about how critical leaders are to culture creation. And what we'd say here is that if your company is really pushing an innovation strategy, then leaders need to support that both with their words as well as their actions. And in other words, so if the company is doing a lot of messaging and communication about innovation, but leaders are undermining that with certain behaviors or certain key decisions, maybe if they're kind of advancing pet projects, or they're not, if they're punishing people for not failing faster, things like this, then it could really be detrimental to the work of innovation. Finally, we heard a lot about leaders who really are pushing their teams to achieve the impossible, as one person phrased it to us. As Mara's section made very clear, innovation's hard, the failure rate's high, it takes a lot of time, a lot of investment. And what that means is that leaders and teams often need to go above and beyond to be successful. And many of you told us that leaders can play a really valuable role in creating the motivation to help these teams kind of put in that extra effort, and also to guide them in their process. So one great story we wanted to share with you that really stood out from a pharmaceutical company is that, just to step back, we know that pharma is a really complicated industry. It takes roughly 10 years and about $1 billion to bring a drug to market, which means that the commercialization piece is super critical. You need to have the regulatory approvals. You need to have good marketing. Otherwise, all that investment goes for naught. And this one company told us that their CEO wanted his regulatory team to really kind of take it up a notch and really perform higher and get a higher rate of approvals. So he gave them a big challenge. He said, I want you to hit 100%. And this team, at first, they had a very big reaction. They thought it was crazy. They resisted. And eventually they kind of came off this emotional perch, and they sort of said to themselves, hey, what if we take it to heart? What if we really try to do what he's asking? And so they innovated their own process, and they rebuilt their regulatory approvals approach from the ground up. And a few years later, this company is now the industry leader in their rate of new drug approvals. Now, again, that's an example of an operational innovation, but it's directly connected to a product. And I think it just goes to show what we talked about in the beginning, that innovation is a very long value chain, that you need all these pieces working together. The next section here is focus on the customer. And this is the second driver of innovation success that you spoke to us about. And this makes perfect sense, very logical, when you consider that innovation is the art of not just inventing products, but commercializing them, bringing them to market, and really getting a customer base. You really want to be very deeply connected to what the customer wants. And for CAHRS partners, this largely falls into 2 camps. People spoke to us about you need to understand the current customer as well as the future customer. So let's just talk for a second about what exactly that means. When it comes to the current customer, what we're talking about here is improving your existing products within your core business, which helps to grow or protect your market share. And within this category, there's really one specific item that we think is worth going into detail about, and that is design thinking. This is a topic that you see in the news a lot these days. Some would say it's a little bit trendy. We think it's a really effective methodology that can bring a lot of success. And for those that aren't familiar with design thinking, this is really about kind of taking a democratic process to looking at a lot of different ideas, pursuing multiple ideas, and doing fast prototyping so that you can quickly figure out what works, and really making sure that your process is deeply connected back to the customer. And one of the pieces of design thinking is empathy for the customer, where you really try to understand what does the customer want, what are their pain points, what delights them, and so that all of your actions with product development are funneled towards those priorities. And this helps companies to think differently, and it also makes sure that the commercialization will be more in line with what the customer wants. And if we think back to Mara's section about missing the market, empathy for the customer and design thinking can be a really powerful antidote to that kind of pitfall. A great example of a customer-first approach came from one consumer company that we spoke with. This company has a certain household product, and this product was going along fine. It was doing well, and the company got feedback that customers really, really loved one piece of this product. And so the company kind of took this to heart, and they sort of thought, what can we do with this feedback? How can we kind of build upon it? And they actually innovated around that one feature, and they created a standalone spin-off product, which has since become a big moneymaker, many years of consistent growth. We thought that really captured how you focus on and delight the customer. As far as the second category of the future customer, one way to think about this, if any of you watch or played hockey, with hockey a lot of times you're always told to watch where the puck is going, not where it is. And that's really what this is about, is where is the market going, where is the customer going, where are they going to be down the road, and that's where you want to be. And this is critical for creating new markets or disrupting existing ones. And it's really about creating products that don't exist and that are outside of your core business. One great observation from a CAHRS partner here was that the amount of innovation that one company can accomplish is really just a drop in the bucket compared to the overall market with all the other companies, all the startups, all the universities. And so it stands to reason that companies need to look externally. And one of the things that they do to go outside is they put together these external learning treks. And the focus, there's a variety of ways you could come at this, but a lot of people try to meet with universities, think tanks, and startups. And the idea is to build relationships, to get new ideas, and to figure out where the market is headed. And this is really valuable to kind of forecasting the future. And as a group, we sort of joke that it sort of reminded us of that famous quote from The Godfather, that you want to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And if it's true that these firms might be your eventual and future disruptors, it's good to know who they are so that you could partner with them or hire them or kind of figure out some way to work with them. And final point here is that firms really need to get good at balancing both of these. You need to focus on your core as well as the future customer and prepare that future pipeline so that you can both grow and survive. Last point here that you spoke to us about was the power and value of disruptive innovation groups. And this directly links back to what we just talked about with thinking of the future and kind of forecasting and filling the pipeline. So we want to talk to you just quickly about what are these groups, why do companies use them, and how do you manage them? So first off, what exactly are disruptive innovation groups? And by nature, they're autonomous groups that really sit outside the core business. And what they do is they look at the future and they try to develop non-existing disruptive products. And what you're trying to do is create a new market, maybe disrupt an existing one. Timelines can be sometimes very different to the core. Sometimes it's faster, but usually it's more futuristic, 5 to 10 years down the road. Now, why do companies use these? A lot of us are familiar with this phrase in business, core capabilities, that we're not going to do something unless it plays into our core capabilities, and it's what drives firm success in a lot of cases. But it's also true that strengths can become weaknesses, and that as companies develop these core capabilities, they become tethered to them. When you spin off your disruptive work into a separate group, it frees them from those core capabilities and kind of it's less parameters to deal with. There's also very different ROI and financial expectations within these groups. If you go back to the core, a lot of partners talk to us that they won't pursue a core business opportunity unless it's worth $300 million or more, and it has to have a certain rate of return. And so again, that really limits opportunities for innovation. So when you spin off this work into a separate group, it empowers the group to act like a startup, which enables them to create these kind of new disruptive technologies. Now, in terms of how you manage these groups, one of the main things that was observed to us is really try to have them report to the C-suite. Mara's section, again, really got into some of the internal communication issues that can happen. Part of what's buried in those details is politics and kind of people wanting to get their way, wanting their group or their business unit to be of importance. And so when you have this group report to the C-suite, it ensures that you have top-level support. The second thing, and this is what we'd really emphasize here, is that you really want the HR elements to be customized here. There's a really great opportunity for HR leaders to have a lot of input and value in the creation of these kinds of groups, and that goes from customizing everything from the talent mix to the team sizes to the physical workspace to the process by which they innovate. All those things really matter. If you're using a cookie cutter approach with these groups, if you think that the same way you set up your core can be used here, I think that's a big mistake, and you really need to really customize it. One story we would share here that we think really stands as a great example on how you set up and manage these groups came from a healthcare company that we spoke with. And a technical leader at this company felt very strongly about the value of digital, mobile, and analytics kind of products for their long-term growth. And so this person really took charge and got the company to commit to an internal innovation group. And as they set up this group, everything they did was customized. As far as their talent mix goes, they brought in kind of a young group of innovation-type workers, coders, UX designers, data scientists, as well as traditional corporate functions, much more like what you'd find in Silicon Valley. Their innovation process leverages design thinking, agile innovation. Their team sizes are small. They have a very customized, very modern physical workspace. And as a result of these very thoughtful, very customized actions, this group is a self-sustaining business, and they're adding value all across the enterprise. And with that, we'll kind of move now to Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Nick. So a bunch of questions coming in kind of in a flurry. I'm trying to keep up. There's one set that really gets at this last idea that you were talking about, Nick, which is companies thinking about setting up this novel, small pirate ship. But in the meantime, you've got the rest of the organization managed under the old way of managing with its existing HR practices. So how are you thinking, and what are the ways that you can manage those two very different cultures so there's not ruffled feathers or people being upset that they're not part of this new special organization?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things we would point to. One is first vision, strategy, communication. I think the companies that seem like they're really the best at innovation are ones who seem to intuitively understand that innovation is not all that different from portfolio investing, in the sense that you want to make a lot of bets knowing that not everything is going to work out, and so you want to be kind of pursuing multiple innovation opportunities. And these disruptive innovation groups allow you to maintain the success of your core while preparing for the future. And the second thing is kind of just going back to what we said earlier, is that the reporting structure is critical. If you have these leaders of these groups report to the head of a business unit or R&D, I think what you start to get is political issues, financial issues. People feel like it's making their business look bad, or maybe they're getting perks that they're not getting. And so I think going right to the C-suite cuts through that clutter and makes it clear that this is a company-wide priority and that it's critical to long-term success.
Great. So a second set of questions comes around this, what I would call a juxtaposition that you guys created. So one, you want leaders that create a vision, are super passionate about their idea or their or the vision that they've set. At the other point, you've got people that have tipped too far, and this becomes escalation of commitment. So how do you manage those two competing forces?
Yeah, I can grab that one. So one thing that I think is a really interesting approach that a lot of firms will take is what they call a stage gate model. And that is, it's a certain step-by-step or phase-by-phase process for how you go about innovation. And each phase has a certain budget, timeline, and milestones that you have to hit. And when it comes time for the check-in, innovation leaders have to basically account for what they've promised to show at the end of that stage. And basically what it does is it creates what some people call wide boulevards with high guardrails. So the leader and his group, or their group, has the freedom to innovate, but with clear expectations, and that if they're not met, then the project doesn't move forward. So there's a lot of incentive to keep it on track.
So this could be tied to the first question I asked you, but some people are also talking about the fact that you've got an organization that's got its core capabilities, it's been doing what it's been doing for a while really successfully, but also a notion of trying to create insights into the future customer. So again, how do you try and create that balance between the two?
I think I can take that one, Chris. So I think the answer is carefully, which of course is going to make everyone chuckle. But that's really the reality is you have to think of your culture, your organization, and what's going to work best. So one CAHRS partner company that we talked to, they had developed a very strategic way of making sure that the core business wasn't going to compete with their new business. And in fact, they had the two of them partnering together because what they found was that their new innovation or technology was going to be cannibalizing some part of the old organization. And the old organization did have information and really critical items that they needed to share. And so the organization incentivized these two to work together, making sure that everybody in the project knew that it wasn't just about, my piece or your piece. It's really about the holistic health of the company, of where we are and where we're going. And so they had developed a partnership to be truly successful.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, just to be sensitive to our time, we're going to move on to our third part, which is Janelle talking about recommendations for you as HR leaders.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. So now that we've seen both the barriers to innovation success and the drivers of innovation success, it may be as clear to you as it was to us that HR can really play a role in a variety of different ways. So here are the recommendations to really utilize HR to its full capacity. Ultimately, we found that HR can be a change agent at all different levels, at the enterprise, functional, individual, or team level. And 4 themes that really were apparent came through, but please reference our white paper for more details. So the first recommendation begins with strategic alignment. HR can ultimately communicate the strategy and align their people in the organization to it. So whether that's distilling the strategies down to more simple frameworks or a branded program, that really helps people feel engaged and involved and feel where they can play a role is very clear. So 2 key pieces come forward with HR aligning that strategy, and it starts with communication. Communicating the strategy and making sure that it's infused throughout all day interactions such as one-on-one sessions, coaching, meetings, emails. HR can really keep driving that strategic alignment throughout the day to make sure everyone feels it's really clear and articulate. The second piece is coaching. So as Mara talked about the barriers of a leader taking on too much or an escalation of commitment, or Nick talking about leaders having this vision, it's really clear that HR can have a critical role in pushing leaders to hold up the mirror to them and set their vision accordingly. We want to make sure as HR leaders that our line leaders and leaders that are performing in the innovation sector and all around the company are really living up to those values. They're leading their teams along the lines of the strategy to really reinforce behaviors and also avoid any innovation pitfalls. And so some people take it even a step farther with the coaching to even align their performance management systems up with innovation. So they're ranking and rating their employees on their innovation different metrics, even if they're not necessarily in the R&D function. The second recommendation involves talent. So as we're all aware, HR really owns this sector and can be strategic with talent in a variety of different ways. But as far as innovation goes, there's 2 themes that really came about. One was pulling the right mix of levers. So hiring those right key talent and leaders that are going to drive that vision, managing those diverse teams and cross-functional people while all those politics exist. Maybe upskilling your talent and redeveloping them. So One unique example that came forth through our interviews was one company uses creativity assessments as well as design thinking. And you may be wondering, what's a creativity assessment? I've never heard of that. It's mostly a Myers-Briggs type test, and it basically is understanding and enhancing a person's innovation style. So how to get everybody engaged in this creativity and passion, even if they're not necessarily in the R&D sector. So it's making sure it looks like everybody's contributing and they all know how they're going to play a role in that innovation. The second piece of talent involves looking externally. So it's really knowing when and how to partner externally. So the when could be if you're missing capabilities, if there's a lack of diversity, if you lack a succession plan, or you have a new project that you don't feel your capabilities are there yet. The how is that some answers came forward were university partnering. So one unique example that we had was this company partnered with engineering universities, and this is a win-win situation because it fuels their capabilities, it adds this young talent pipeline, and then not only that, but they're acquiring the intellectual property of the new ideas that come about with this partnership, which we thought was a great idea. The second piece is also being strategic with where you're placing your location. So in the hub of a tech center could be a great way to really get the best talent. We just really caution around making sure these external talent people that come in really are fitting this culture that you're trying to build and that their needs are met so that you can retain them long term. So that dives into our third recommendation involving culture. So every single organization we talked to was from different industries, they had different innovation styles, but I think it's most important that you know what your innovative culture looks like currently and then what it should look like or what you're striving for, and be willing to change where those gaps lie. The second piece is creating and managing this diverse portfolio of culture creation efforts. So some people talked about utilizing org design or internal hackathons. Other companies say, okay, 20% of your day to their employees, 20% of your day you can work on anything that you want. And so that really cultivates this culture of experimentation and finding out problems that they can really solve for. And it also makes a spirit of failing fast and also why not mentality. The third piece is utilizing appropriate compensation and recognition methods. So this ultimately is to reinforce your company norms and pull on those cultural values that you're really trying to get. So if you really want collaboration and sharing of knowledge interwoven throughout your organization, then make sure that's incentivized. So one company in particular has really long cycles of innovation that we talk to. On average, it takes 12 years till they see an innovative result. And so that could be really challenging to incentivize and evaluate their people. So they have their HR team be very strategic in incentivizing their people. Even if they were to leave, they get patents and equity options long term. So then in the short term, they're motivated and driven to really produce results in that now and really cultivate a culture that is constantly finding solutions and being innovative. So lastly, our fourth recommendation involves knowledge and information sharing. So as we saw at the beginning, HR is embedded in every single sector of the business, which is a very unique opportunity to really shape the knowledge and information because they are touching every piece of the company that no one else really has a hold over. So as we talked about, you need to be focused on the current customer and then also seeing and seeking out future opportunities for the customer. And HR can really play a role here to help you get closer to that and seek those opportunities out. One story that came about was a CAHRS partner in the industrial space who proactively leads annual treks to innovation hubs. And this really enables the HR team to really gather insights and make decisions further on their partnerships and how they can build out capabilities in the future. So HR can really do wonders with field research, maybe exposing your customers or your employees to the products and making advocates for your products and gaining feedback so you don't miss the market early on. The second piece is HR can play a role in structuring your physical workspace. So if you want organic day-to-day conversations, maybe having an open environment and getting the right people in the right places so they're bumping into each other and all of a sudden building this big network that innovation can flow naturally. The third piece is HR could possibly partner with IT to really create and capture an internal database system that captures lessons learned. So as Mara talked about, people are always forgetting what happened, where did the failure go, and what was successful about it. And so having this internal database will really help share the information widely. One key example we had, one CAHRS partner does have a database like this with the successes and failures of their innovation stories, and they came across one that really inspired them. They saw an engineer that didn't have the resources, the network, and capabilities, and they decided to take this as an opportunity to coach that person. They went out of their way after seeing this story, coached them, found the resources, and made it a collaborative goal to work toward his goal, and they ultimately were successful. So that's the conclusion of our 4 recommendations, and now we're open to questions and answers.
Great, thanks, Janelle. So a couple of questions coming in. So this notion of shift in culture. So many companies for the last decade or two have really built up this culture of what I call the culture of execution. So how do you move from that, where there's penalties for not executing, to this notion where failure is okay, or failing fast is better than not taking any risk?
You know, I think that's honestly a tough one, Chris, but I think through a lot of our communication, it starts with leadership. I can think of one really excellent story, a technology firm we talked to. There was an influential leader, and he was discussing how he went through this process of a really big failure for the organization. And the CEO approached him that day and said, I want you to know that even though this was a failure, the thing I'm most scared about occurring in the future is you not willing to take these type of risks again. So the CEO wasn't even concerned about the failure. And yes, well, we do have to have some consequences, or we have to make sure to mitigate these. It's really important to embed it in the heart and soul of your organization in order to become an innovative culture.
Great. So Janelle, you mentioned a couple times, or at least a couple different ways that companies are working to make sure knowledge is flowing throughout the organization. Any others that came up besides the 3 mentioned in the presentation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as far as the 3 we mentioned, there's also just this overall moving of talent can really break down those silos. So a lot of companies we talk to use cross-functional teams to move them around. There could also be informal networking sessions such as brown bag, or utilizing your employee resource groups, maybe the internal hackathon. But it's important to note what's best for your culture. So if it has already networking sessions, maybe it'll already happen and HR doesn't really need to play a strong hand. But if it's more of a closed off environment where people aren't as organically talking, maybe HR can play a stronger hand and really facilitate those networking opportunities to make sure that information is shared widely.
Great. Again, just be sensitive to our time. I know we're almost to a close. A number of people are asking about the white paper. So if you go on the CAHRS website, which is CAHRS, CAHRS.ilr.cornell.edu, the paper's posted there, the white paper. There's also a number who are asking about the innovating in HR function itself. So there's also, on the CAHRS website, there's some prior webcasts on topics like consumer-driven HR and design thinking in HR that you might also find helpful. With that, I just want to turn it back to Mara to wrap us up.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I hope all of you today have really enjoyed this presentation. From what we've given you, I'm sure that you can see that no matter the driver of the category, HR can play a vital role in innovation. So we think there's 3 areas that HR can play the strongest one that are some of the biggest success factors to innovation, and that's leadership, organizational strategy, and capabilities such as talent. So these success factors can really influence innovation. Of course, as we learned, innovating is not easy. There's change, complexity, and competition, as well as internal pressures, such as from the board of the directors or the pressure to turn a quick profit. Ultimately, the line between success and failure with innovation is very thin, but we think that HR can really do a lot to make sure that there's more successes than failure outcomes. So with that, we want to thank you so much for tuning in today, and we really appreciate your time.
Great. I want to thank each of the three students for a lot of great work, a lot of good interviews. Again, there's more details on most of the parts that they talked about and pieces that they didn't get to today in their white paper. Also want to remind you that we've got more webcasts upcoming and more CAHRS RA research headed your way. So this fall, our CAHRS RAs are working on a project tied to changes and new thinking in terms of HR operations, and also then a second group of students working next year towards thoughts on the impact of technology, both on organizations and the function. So keep looking on the CAHRS website and for email updates from us on future programs. Again, thanks all three for a great job.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the ILR School at Cornell University.